My name is Ken Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the fledgling organization that we call Water Infrastructure Network, otherwise known as WIN Colorado. As briefly as I can, share with you a little bit about who WIN Colorado is, what we're about, and what we're hoping to accomplish here today. Essentially, we are a coalition of Coloradans seeking increased private sector investment and more local, state, and federal funding for the multi-billion-dollar backlog of largely unfunded drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater projects across the state of Colorado. So I'm going to move directly into segment one, which we have titled A Fresh Look at Public-Private Partnerships, otherwise known as P3s. And our provocateur is Dr. Neil Grigg, who is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Colorado State University, where he teaches graduate courses in infrastructure and water resource management. Our panel today, Dr. Grigg will be joined by Brian Burnett, who serves as the president of Bohannon Houston Engineering. It's an engineering and spatial data company that is headquartered in Albuquerque. We're also joined by Peter Binney, who is a professional engineer with over 35 years of experience in the public and private sector, both in the United States and internationally. We are joined also by Lowell Clary, the president of Clary Consulting, and I have to add that Lowell traveled all the way from Florida to be with us here today. So I especially appreciate the time and effort that he put in. Our moderator for that panel will be Chris Woodka. Chris Woodka is one of Colorado's most knowledgeable and prolific water and water infrastructure reporters in the state. He's earned a BS in journalism from Northern Arizona University, and he's been a reporter with the Pueblo Chieftain since 1985. So with that, Dr. Grigg, I will turn it over to you. And again, you're able to follow along here both on the screen and in your book.
Thank you. Thanks. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me in the back all right? You know, with the thank you. Good. Well, when Ken asked me to be the provocateur, my first thought was that sounds like a good way to get your name in the newspaper today or get in jail with all the things that are going on. But I guess it's all right. You know, I'll try to fill that role. And since we've got such a great panel here, I think the opportunity to get some really insightful information on this is terrific right now. Before I start, could I just take a survey to see where people are from? And I'll just ask you if you first are with a local government of some kind, if you just raise your hand. And how about consulting engineering companies? Anybody from like the financial community that's different? And what about associations or interest groups and anything that I left out? I wouldn't want you to feel left out. Well, thank you. I'm just going to speak a few minutes, and what I'll present is basically what comes from my courses at Colorado State University and these books that Ken mentioned, and our panel has got some terrific experience in real-world applications of different kinds. I haven't actually met Lowell yet, but I look forward to hearing from him about actual PPP types of projects that are being organized. So if we could, now Tim's going to run my thing for me. So this is a problem that we are addressing, is just where we're going to find that money and what the specifics of the PPP might be in making a contribution to that. So I'm trying to focus on that. And when you think about this, you think about the fact that it's really a new world in funding. It's a new water industry. People are talking about that everywhere I go. And it's not just the public sector people, it's private sector people too. You open up the Wall Street Journal, you'll find full-page ads for how this company is making contributions to water and that company is doing that. And it's really, just a fast-moving thing. But if you look at where we came from in the past, actually there's some precedents that are still governing a lot of the things that we're doing now. And not to make a long speech out of this, but if you go back to the New Deal, that's basically when a lot of the subsidies really got started, like rural development projects and all of that. Well, if you fast forward, a lot of people thought that the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson was another version of the New Deal, and there were a lot of subsidies that were put into place then. Probably the biggest was the Clean Water Act Construction Grants Program. Probably a lot of you got some funding from that. I was in charge of part of that at one time, and there was a lot of money that flowed through that, and it flowed rather easily compared to what we've got today. But today, almost all of these government programs are way down, with the possible exception of the recent TARP and different stimulus types of programs. But what we're doing now is these revolving funds, and there's a revolving fund for construction grants and a revolving fund for safe drinking water at the federal level, and those are translated into the funds for the state revolving banks that Ken mentioned. And this is pretty much the precedent of where we are today and where we have to launch from for the new funding. So, Tim? So what we have today is a different set of funding possibilities on the public side. None of them are very robust. None of them are easy to tap into for any large amounts of funding. They're basically set up as enterprise funds for the most part, with the exception of some of the stimulus types of funding, one-time funding that you might tap into. But you're not going to be able to count on that with any reliability for very much time. So looking at the current picture today, the financial picture, I wouldn't have to say much to you about any of this, but it's pretty clear with the housing in the deep freeze, the construction industry flat and struggling, everybody wondering about the future economic advancement of the United States, people kind of strapped, having a hard time raising rates, people not always able to pay a whole lot more, but many of them not willing to pay a whole lot more. And at the same time, we're getting behind on our infrastructure. Peter Benny was just talking about that a few minutes ago and would probably have some statistics on it. You probably already know that anyway, that we're just kind of getting behind. So that's the current picture that we have. And then the origins of the PPP idea kind of go back to the breaking apart of the Soviet Union, many different political things, Reagan and Thatcher. There was a lot of fascination with privatization. I kind of tracked it starting about 1980. You would hear a lot of papers about it and experiments that were launched. And over in the UK, they privatized the water industry. That's a long story. A good bit of experimentation with privatization in the United States and all around the world. And so we got some experience with that, and there were some successes, and there's also been a lot of disillusionment with it. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the water business is changing fast, and this disillusionment is part of it. Another part of it is the increasing participation of the private sector in a lot of different aspects, not only of the water business, but also infrastructure in general. And maybe Lowell could comment on that because there's a lot of action in it. A lot of it's in Florida, too, that I've been tracking. So the latest book that I wrote about this is this one that you see here. It's not as exciting a book as some of those exposés that are out there about the water business. There's a couple of them. What is the latest one? The Big Thirst or something. It's really good books that are out there talking about this dramatic change. My book is more statistics and just my attempt to explain what's going on from a standpoint of the economic picture. So as you study this and how the PPPs can be considered, you really kind of evolve out of what people refer to as privatization into a more flexible and nimble model that we're now referring to as a PPP. About 10 years ago, I organized a panel where we would look at what was going on in the public works arena. And the people who were on hand at that time identified, mainly public works director type folks, identified 3 ways that you could organize and finance your operation. One of them was a traditional model, and the idea there was to be more efficient, just do a good job as a government agency. Another one was a pure privatization model, which didn't fly too well in a lot of cases. And the third was managed competition, which was being implemented by Charlotte, North Carolina at the time. And the idea there was to sort of decompose your services in the city and allow the private sector to bid on a lot of different services. They called it managed competition at the time. I think some new names for that have come up. But the PPP models are kind of mixtures of these different older models that we had out there, and they offer new possibilities and new things that we can think about. So if you want to track that, and there's just 2 or 3 slides here that we'll go through quickly, you could go to the web page of this group here, the National Council on Public-Private Partnerships, and you could find the definitions. You could study up on exactly how these are supposed to work, and you could learn a lot about it. But I'll just flip through these. Let's go ahead and go to the next one and the next one, and just stop on this one just a second. The one example that they've got for PPP in the water sector was the Tampa Bay Water Desalination Plant. And that's a big project. It's got a kind of a checkered history. It started out not as a PPP deal, but Tampa Bay Water, which is a regional water authority in the Tampa area, tried to go it themselves, but they had a lot of difficulties. Maybe it's the next slide that I've got my summary of the details on that. But to make a long story short, they ended up involving American Water in financing it and part of it and running it and all of that. Of course, American Water is the United States' #1 in size private water company, and they have a lot of capabilities and possibilities to do things, but they can't run every PPP deal that's out there, although they're eager to find ones that are profitable for them. So this slide and a couple of the next ones, there's kind of like an acronym list or a laundry list of different possibilities for PPPs. We could just flip through the next one there, Tim, and let's go on to the next one. And you can see it's just a lot of initials and different ways that you can go about doing this. And these are all interesting, but smart people who've got common interests can get together and figure out how to do contracting that works like this. So there's nothing magic in any of these particular models. So what would be the new possibilities for the water industry as to how we could implement some of these PPP deals? And does it have to be as large as Tampa Bay Water, or are there other ways that you could go? Well, it's not going to be an easy thing to figure out, because pure privatization, to sell off all of your assets, has a lot of political problems. Peter might mention some of those. Even things like operating contracts are not always the best. There's a lot of experience and possibilities out there, but I'm here to suggest possibilities that might be other than those that you've already heard about. So one of the things that you could think about doing is breaking systems apart. So the decomposition, the unbundling, the way that the electric power industry has done and some other industries, to see if there's some attractive investment opportunities for parts of either infrastructure or operations that might fly. You can see it more in the water and wastewater side than you can on the stormwater side. The stormwater side doesn't have as good of an income stream for the most part. In a lot of places, such as Colorado Springs, there's even been some backlash against some of them that I've heard about, and people call it like rain tax, and this gets to this public willingness to pay again. So there's a lot of issues there. And I'll just kind of say a word about this slide because I want to get to the panel as quickly as we can. But there's a lot of experience out there with private water companies, private sector involvement. We don't have as much of it in Colorado as they do in other parts of the country. A lot of people don't know that New York City's water supply system was originated as a private investment by a guy named the one that assassinated, or I'm not thinking of his name right now, the one who killed Alexander Hamilton in the duel. Yeah, Aaron Burr. He was the brains behind that, and that's a long story. But American Water is another long story that's really interesting. It's got an entrepreneur named John Ware who assembled that when a power and water combined company was broken apart. And there's a lot of other stories up there about these private water companies. They're all interesting, and they offer possibilities for thinking about what could be done in the future. But just as a word of caution, I put this one in here. I called it the Cochabamba story. Cochabamba is a town in Bolivia where they basically had a riot, where the people came out of the woodwork and they got a privatization reversed because they were so much against it. And if you want to understand that kind of thinking, all you have to do is go down here on Broadway and see all the people who are camped out, you know, with this anti-business, anti-government feeling and all that. And there's a lot of that out there where people don't like privatization of something like water that they consider almost holy and not something that should be turned over to business. So what to do at the end of the day? Do you go that traditional model? You kick the can down the road with better business and all of that? Do you increase debt when it's hard to pay for it? And I was tempted to throw a couple of slides in here about the Jefferson County, Alabama bond issue that's been really bad, or the recent bankruptcy of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, you know, things like that. But I avoided doing that. Or could you look at a public-private partnership? Maybe the panel will have some ideas about that. And my idea about that, let's go to the next one, Tim, is there's details on each one of those. I'll skip those just in terms of what they mean. But I think you can get the idea as to what's good to look into and what's not good to look into. But on the public-private partnerships, I'll finish with just a couple of quick slides on this. The idea is to create an attractive investment that is going to appeal to somebody who's got the money so that you can put a deal together. So it's going to require some creative thinking about how that's going to work. There are a lot of details. It goes way beyond a big plant like Tampa Bay Water. Chris Woodka, for example, knows a lot about public-private partnership types of deals with water rights and source of supply. Maybe he'll say some things about that. All kinds of possibilities here once you could figure out how to break your operation into parts so that you could offer it to investors. And I won't bother you with a lot of details on this, but I was searching in my mind for a good example of that, and I wanted to show you British Rail. When the UK privatized a lot of stuff back in the 80s, one of the entities that was privatized was British Rail. Now, you've got operating companies and you have infrastructure there. So they broke the operating companies away from the infrastructure, and they created an infrastructure company called Network Rail. So you can have a private enterprise that just operates infrastructure and creates an income stream, but you have to figure out how to do it by unbundling your system that way. So the last couple of slides here, one question is, well, where's the money? Well, on the left, this is a model I created of the financial and fixed assets of the United States, just to see how many there were of all of this. On the right-hand side is the fixed assets, public and private side. On the left-hand side are the financial assets of the United States. The financial assets of the United States total about $150 trillion. You've got insurance companies, you've got pension funds in there, you've got private equity funds, you've even got individual investors. There are a lot of people who've got money who are looking for a place to invest that. Maybe Lowell could shed more light on that because he'd be working on that every day. But what it would take to interest them is, well, you can figure it out. It needs to be some kind of a safe, attractive investment that's going to yield a better return for them in today's turbulent times than they can get at other investment deals that they get to. So probably the next one is my last slide. Bottom line is it isn't going to be easy in the future, but there's a lot of possibilities out there. It's going to take some creative thinking, and I think in the future you're going to see a lot more creativity. Last slide there. So that's my contact information if anybody wants to talk to me any further. And I think the idea now is that Chris would come up and take over and moderate. So I'll welcome Chris Woodka to the podium. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to take Neil's survey a step further. How many of you from water districts have a private manager? How many of you are a private manager for a district? So we have a little bit of both here already that have those partnerships. So And that's kind of the scale that we're working on. I thought I'd open it up with some basic information and ask each of the panelists to give one example of a public-private partnership that worked particularly well or one that didn't work well. And I thought that would probably be a good way to get them started talking. So I guess we'll start maybe with Brian, since you have the microphone.
From my perspective, you know, to answer the question about projects that work and don't work, I look at this entire P3 conversation from the standpoint of partnerships. And I think even if one sits down and negotiates a solution with those interested parties, you can say that you are participating in a public-private partnership. And I think what we're going to be talking about here today more is a sophistication and scale issue as it relates to implementing some of these methods and approaches. And for example, right now, Colorado is very much focused on the Eagle P3 project, transportation related. This is an $8 billion project, and it encompasses a very complex set of relationships. I think when we talk about scaling this down and working at our local levels, we need to keep in mind that there are differences in terms of how we structure these partnerships. So I have seen many projects where the agency has been a good negotiator between the parties and has developed solutions that have been very attractive. And I encourage you and all of us to think about ways that we can improve those types of negotiations. I've also been involved recently with some large projects where we have really been struggling with this proof of return, the income flow, the financing element, very sophisticated features for agencies, municipalities, and it's been a real struggle. So I think there are good examples on the one side, and then there are very complex examples on the other where it just hasn't worked yet because of scale and sophistication.
Okay, we'll go to Lowell.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up, if that's okay. I was a public official for many years, like many of you are, and had the opportunity to try to figure out ways to do more with less and to come up with how to deliver projects best. Florida has been on the forefront of what I would call outsourcing. There's a very robust industry of both contractors and engineering firms. They do very good work, and that's been done very well in Florida because it's been a growth state, very much like Colorado. So many areas have been growing fast, and the normal resources haven't been able to keep up with that. So it was augmented on project-specific situations. You talked about unbundling, Dr. Grigg. That's exactly a good way to look at it. Okay, how many in here have done a design-build project? Okay, quite a number of you. You've already done a P3. Okay, the contractor took risk by designing and building that project. And in many cases, he gave you a firm fixed price within certain limits. Okay, that's sharing risk. That's a P3. Okay, the next element is, can you take it to an element of financing? The bond markets today are very difficult. Okay, it's a very challenging market. The tax-exempt bond market this year has been pretty much fairly, you know, how shall we put it, in the dumps. Okay, so you have to look at other opportunities. In Florida, we did a design-build finance approach. Okay, where the contractor brought financing with him. Now you may think, is that cost effective? Okay, well, I'll tell you, it is cost effective because we have driven it in a direction where it's effective in the process. Okay, and I'm getting back to Brian's comment. You have to have a well-developed process for this. The other example I will give is controlling cost. I'm going to take a big project example. This is one I was the project champion on the public side. It was a tunnel. Okay, the government estimate for the tunnel was $1.1 billion. Okay, $1.1 billion. Okay, the contractors who develop this type of tunneling are international. They said, hey, can we do it a different way? Okay, we'd like to do it a P3 way. So the state said, okay, we'll do that. They came in at $665 million, fixed price. Okay, now why did they do that? They did that because, one, it's a type of tunneling they do and they do well. They have very patented technologies, and they were able to drive the cost down. In addition, it's a very, very competitive market. Okay, so they sharpened their pencils and they got very competitive in that situation. I've got a slide in here that you can look at in the presentation that talks about what a study in Australia found. That study in Australia found privately delivered projects came in pretty much on budget, and they came in ahead of schedule. Now, why does that happen? Okay, they had disincentives built into it. And trust me, the private sector will not allow that to happen. They're not going to take a penalty if it's going to impact their financing. On the public side, they were 15% over budget, and they were 20+% late. Okay, now has anybody experienced that in a project? Has anybody seen a traditional project, raise your hand, that was over budget and late? Come on. Okay, those are elements you can unbundle and build into this. Controlling cost, delivering schedules, particularly when you have to.
Well, thanks a lot. Actually, if I could refer you to the material that you have there, I'm going to refer to a graphic that looks like this. And what it does is it illustrates the range of what P3s can take for you. As Lowell mentioned, anybody who's done a design build, that's P3 on training wheels. It's probably the least risk and least private sector involvement. So the success story I'll share with you is a design build project. But do have a look at that, because if there's one thing I'd like you to leave today with the understanding is that when we talk about P3, we're not talking about privatization. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the conversation short circuits over into a loss of control or a concern about your customers being influenced by that evil profit motivator. So do have a look at that one graphic and understand that a portfolio of P3 options are available to you. And you can go all the way up to the concession model, which is the UK approach, which is basically where a private sector entity is commercialized this public service that we talk about. Things that don't work well, I'm going to turn back to the Tampa project because as Dr. Grigg mentioned, there's, eventually they got it right, but it took 3 bankruptcies to get to that point. And I think in talking with the managers down there, they had a very immature model at the time of what the offering actually was that they went to the marketplace with. They had bundled new technologies, they had bundled capital investment construction projects with a long-term concession responsibility. It just didn't come together well. But I think that now they've got a 20-year plus concession that is, the technologies and the membranes eventually are working on a commercial basis. So also in the slides, you'll see some, while there's no magic bullet, I have put together some of the findings that we see in the business of what does make for a successful P3. And it's, everybody seems to be in surveys here, so I'll do one as well. Does anybody work for a board or a council that wants to double their costs tomorrow? There's a pregnant pause. Anybody here speak Greek? Okay, well, you're in the right room then. In terms of success, then, I'd share with you the experience that we had when I was the director of Aurora Water. The Hayman fire changed the water quality of the South Platte fairly much overnight. And the city of Aurora had 2 direct filtration plants which were patently inadequate for dealing with highly turbid water coming off the forest fire areas. So we went into a design build project for the Wemlinger water treatment plant. It was at the time the second of the 2 plants that the city had available to it. And it was basically a sand filter. It was an aquarium that we put chlorine in and served it up to our customers. That worked really well, except when you had highly turbid water and the filters were running about 20 minutes of runtime. So we went from an 80 million gallon a day treatment plant down to about 5 or 6. So we had to do something fast and we had to do it effectively. So we set up a design build project with a contractor. It had a fixed price. It was $24 million, which is what the council had approved. But we also had to break the construction cycle. We could only work on this treatment plant during the winter months. During the summer months, we had to put it back online to meet the customer's needs. So we had an on-off, on cycle. But the design build project that we set up with the contractor was an at-risk. We did set aside a contingent amount for the contractor and for the city. It was a 50-50 value proposition. I think the things that worked well with this is that it was an outcome-based contract. We got away from that horrible approach that we have here in the United States of doing design, bid, build. Now, as an engineer, we do these beautiful drawings. I mean, Leonardo will look back on these 500 years and say, we designed this thing right down to the last bolt. And that's not the way you do a P3. What you do is you describe the outcomes or the metrics that will define a successful project, and then you give the contractor and your staff and your engineers the ability to adapt in the field. So out of that, the value bucket that we put out there, it was eventually allocated 50-50 to the city and to the contractor. The project came in under budget. I allowed my project manager in the field to negotiate within certain limits for field variances. He and I would only talk on a Friday afternoon and when he needed a lot of money, as in over $100,000. We spent more time drinking beer and less time talking about $100,000 change orders, and it worked real well. So there's an example that worked well.
Okay, good. Neil, do you want to weigh in on that, or?
I'll just say a quick word. I just formulated 3 quick examples. Chris's question was, and my first one was, when the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District got organized in Denver, one of the first things they did was to figure out that they needed some help with maintenance, so they let their maintenance out on a contract. That was a long time ago, but that's worked very well and is one example. Another one is just the contract operations, like of a treatment plant. For example, Springfield, Massachusetts wastewater plant is operated by a private company, works well. I visited there. And my last example was just pushing the box and thinking about a theoretical situation. Say you need some money and you need to build some new infrastructure, for example, a new water transmission line or a new UV disinfection plant or something that's going to cost a lot of money. There's no reason that you couldn't unbundle that and put it out as an asset for somebody to build and lease back to you or something, you know, come together with some kind of a deal like that. So those are just a few thoughts on examples.
Okay, when a district needs something, how does it find the private contractor that's going to get it what it needs? What are some of the avenues there? And I think that might help people in this room a lot to understand. Anybody, I'll give it a jump ball there, whoever wants to weigh in.
As a former public official, you know, the private industry is very interested right now. So it's not going to take a ton of effort to get them interested. I think the key thing is defining your goals and objectives very much as you did in the city of Aurora. And then, you know, what we did in the past was vendor forums, which can be as little as a day, where basically you invite the contractors in, you describe the project, and you let them give you ideas. We had to do that a little bit in a one-on-one session with some of the contractors because they didn't want to talk in a big room, which is understandable. And then basically that helped define putting a procurement process together and put it on the street.
Did it change the project as you went through that process?
Yes, it did. And you're gonna get input from both sides, both from the private side as well as your own team. And, you know, it's very much a learning process as you go through that. Because you're gonna find things that are agreeable by all parties. You find other things where there's kind of 50-50 and you have to make a call on what you're gonna do. You find other things where the private side comes in and says, we can't do this, and you have to decide how you're going to approach it.
Okay, anyone else, same question?
I think you'll find that there are more and more teams being developed as we speak that combine the engineering, the construction, the financing, the legal elements, the administrative approval processes. And if you're interested in these types of things, and speaking from the private sector, I think we're looking for opportunities to sit down with people who believe that at this point they have the infrastructure and the wherewithal to do something like this and just start the dialogue and learn about what it's going to take. And I think that can be informal and it can be more formal, maybe through an RFP process. But I think as we go along, all of us are going to have to come to some common ground in terms of terminology. I think there's a lot, as was pointed out, there's confusion over what this term really means, what it entails. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, I think you will find quite a few people that would be interested in talking with you.
Peter?
Yeah, let me just share a couple of anecdotes. I spend probably too much time back in Washington nowadays. But what I'm finding back there is there's been a fundamental change in the private sector and what they're looking for in their participation with these P3s. They've moved from this concept of the venture capital approach, which is the easy win, flip the project, get out of there, more to a 30, 40, and 50-year concession. What the private sector is generally looking for nowadays is long-term, reliable revenue streams. So what people are looking for is quite different, but they're looking for other things as well now. What they're looking for are public entities that can adapt their procurement cycles and their regulations to reflect the different business risk that you see with a public-private contract. So there are several things that they do look for. One is from a procurement standpoint. One is they look for a champion within the entity that they're going to do business with, because you've got to get over the inertia of doing things the old-fashioned way. They are looking for somebody who's prepared to take the political and the media heat and the customer concern about a profit motive in what is generally looked on as a public service. But again, have a look at the material that's in your book. I think that there are some common stepping stones that, at least when I'm talking with folks like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and some of the insurance companies that are looking to place money into funds like this, there are probably half a dozen things, when they go through their risk profiling of you folks out there, that's what they're looking for.
Okay, Neil?
And just a quick word to add to that, and I kind of echo what Brian was talking about, and also Lowell. If you look at the restructuring of the consulting engineering business and also the construction business in general, there are so many companies that are morphing into different forms. They're looking for partnerships. They're integrating their different services. They're looking for opportunities, and if a public sector group can be creative in unbundling and creating packages that meet the requirements that we were just discussing up here, I feel sure that there's going to be groups that will come out of the woodwork ready to talk and ready to bid, ready to negotiate on that.
Okay, in my part of the world, the Arkansas Valley, we have a large project going in the Arkansas Valley Conduit, which is addressing some needs of several smaller water districts. Is there anyone here from the Arkansas Valley today? Okay, got some people here. Okay, In that conduit, a lot of things have come up. There've been some meetings held where they've talked about regionalization, and Peter and I were talking briefly before this panel today about the benefits of regionalization and reaching economies of scale through that. And maybe I'll let Peter start, since it was his idea, what he wanted to say about that. So.
Many of the projects that we're talking about nowadays are very large capital costs. And that's being driven by technology, by regulation, by the fact that you have to interconnect areas that are geographically just long distances apart. I mean, the Arkansas Valley Conduit, I think, is a good example where rather than doing decentralized reverse membrane projects up along the length of the Arkansas Valley, the proposition is to build a single pipeline from Pueblo Reservoir and run it down towards the Kansas border. Unfortunately, what you find is that very large capital cost, you have to have a large customer base, especially with what's happening nowadays with the federal government basically leaving the building in funding capital or water projects. The harsh reality is that most of these projects have been funded at the local level anyway. So it's simple math. You take the capital cost of a project plus the operating cost, you divide it by the number of customers, and you find out whether it's a project that's affordable. So as the capital cost is going up, really the only options that you have of any significance is to consolidate your demand base, which means more customers, which means that many water districts are going to have to start looking at working with their neighbors to put these solutions in place. It's what's happening in Douglas County with the WISE program. It's there are consolidations of demand groups between up to 15 different districts to enter into an agreement with Aurora and Denver, and to pay for the capital costs of the projects down there. So I think that there are two competing forces going on at the moment. One is regionalization, which is addressing your ability to actually afford a capital project. Running counter to that in some of the water market, though, is decentralization, which is pushing for satellite wastewater plants and building them into, say, water reclamation plants. But I think that the days of having 60,000 different water providers around the United States are probably numbered. Certainly if you have any growth on your system, or if you've got aging infrastructure, and I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't suspect any time in the near future state or federal government is going to be a significant player in funding water projects any time in the near future. We're going to have to look for other approaches, and I think regionalization or centralization or aggregation of demand centers is going to be one of the few ways that you're going to have to be able to afford these types of large capital projects.
Okay, anyone else care to weigh in on that?
I get across a lot of industries, and the bottom line is you are seeing what I call the pushing down of the responsibilities consistently, and a lot of people call it devolution of responsibility as well as funding. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There's going to have to be economies of scale. There's going to have to be other elements built into this. And one point I wanted to make on what Dr. Griggs said earlier, okay, the funding and the financing in the United States is changing rapidly. And what I want to mean by that is insurance companies and pension funds, a lot of you are in pension funds, they had huge pools invested in real estate. How do you think that went? Okay, they're looking at changing their focuses now, and a lot of them are going into infrastructure. So you've got a lot of capital coming into the market, and when you talked about patient capital, that's what it is. Okay, those are folks that are looking at a nice return over an extended time period. The days of 12% returns for pension funds are probably gone. Okay, they're looking at a more reasonable return, and that's your equity, and they do borrow money. They're gonna borrow money from banks and from the bond market, the same as you would do. So it's just a different approach to financing and funding. And what's happened in the United States is really pushing a lot of this forward with the difficulty in the public bond market, with tax exempt debts and these other financing mechanisms coming forward at the same time.
I'm Lee Merkel with the Department of Local Affairs. I cover the Southeast as a regional manager out of Pueblo. And Dr. Neal, I don't mean this as any kind of an assault on your presentation, Lori, but I think you missed two things. You said that the regulatory environment is flat. It is not. That the implementation of regulations that have been contemplated by EPA are being implemented by the State Water Quality Division. And if you're a small town in the Arkansas Valley that has a generated lagoon that no longer meets the non-discharged groundwater regs, $1 million or $1.5 million cost is huge to you, and it is not a regulatory environment that's flat. It's a new reg to them, whether they've been told about it or not for the last 10 years. And if you have 60 residents or 600 residents, $1 million is a lot of money. It's a heck of a lot more to 60 residents, but it's still going to apply, and you're going to have to pay for it somehow. And we're in an environment where foundations, grant regulation, agencies, loan agencies are stretched in a way that they haven't been in modern times. So it's a huge challenge. There's been discussion of rolling back regulations. I don't see the EPA talking about it.
Okay,
The second comment would be that people's willingness and ability to pay is not flat too. And again, no disrespect, but most people I know are making less money now than they were in 2008. And their ability and willingness to pay is not level, and they don't want to pay a 2 or a 5% increase each year for their water and sewer fees. They would really prefer to pay less. So when you talk about these issues, it's huge, and it just further draws the line in the sand for the whole WIN mission here to define where we are and how we've got to face the challenges. And again, no disrespect to you.
No, I put that in there because I was supposed to be a provocateur.
Okay, let's get back. There are a couple serious points there. We have unfunded mandates and unfunded ratepayers. So if you want to address how we get around those two things that are squeezing everything into a
Well,
pitch
you
point
don't
there.
get around it, but I think that's an important thing from a public policy standpoint. Are we going to start means testing and directing where whatever available funds we do have to work with are going to go? It's already happening. I mean, you know, in Aurora, we were self-funded. We found that it was not reasonable for us to use the Water and Power Authority as a conduit issuer. You know, so you've already had this partitioning in the marketplace. I mean, some of the things that I think we're going to have to wrestle with as a society are how are we going to deal with these mandates? I mean, there's a proposal in Congress at the moment. You know, here's one for everybody to think whether this is going to pass, that we change the tax exempt status of private activity bonds. I mean, what's the likelihood of that? I mean, that's one of the solutions to this type of thing where you can perhaps get some more money flowing out into the marketplace. I strongly suspect that what is going to happen is that we are going to have Class A, Class B, and Class C water systems out there, and whatever funds we do have are going to be directed where the social need cannot be supported at the local level. I mean, that's what society does. But what that's going to do is it's going to put the squeeze on the middle group. You know, it's maybe the 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 people type communities that are not going to have access to those means tested funds, and they probably won't have the economy of scale that a Denver Water or a Metro or Colorado Springs Utilities will have to deal with. So where are we going to set the bar between a B and a C? I would suspect that C is going to be a very small group for the near term at least, and Washington's going to have to deal with that.
That raises an interesting question. If we have a tier level water systems there, do any of you see what happened with public schools probably 30 years ago of a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit perhaps, entering into there and creating even more havoc by,
Well, I think that that's about ready to happen now. I mean, there's going to be brinksmanship between the regulators and the customers and their ability to pay. I think that if it's not there, it's going to be there very quickly, and that's going to force the division between regulators and the people who are paying the bills, the unfunded mandate. If it's not there now, it'll be there pretty quickly.
okay, Neil?
Just real quick, and then depends on the flat rating on there. I would definitely agree that in terms of this regulatory agenda, it wouldn't be flat. If you look at the legislative history of safe drinking water or clean water, I don't think that EPA and folks out there are ever going to stand for the tier standards. There's going to be lawsuits and all of that. Peter's probably got some other things in mind about how the realistic aspect of that, but in terms of accepting that, it'd be really hard.
Okay, Brian has.
Just want to make a quick comment about the regulatory environment. Ken and I have spent a lot of time talking about the focus of this organization and how do we promote collectively. And let me say that we're very excited to be a part of WIN Colorado, and I encourage all of you to think about becoming members and finding ways that you can contribute your expertise to help Ken and the different associations really spread this message. But I think collectively we're going to have to come to grips with developing a voice around what is, let's say, sound or common ground regulations. My concern is that as time goes on, we ratchet down further and further, and when you really take a look at the cost of things, the cost of building water projects, many times it's driven by changing regulatory conditions that just become more and more difficult to meet. And I think now is a really good time to start to try and create a voice as to what really makes sense so that we can consider value add and we can consider the return on investment as we look at these regulations. And we certainly work within all of the codes and regulations that are out there, and we support good regulation, but I think we're hitting a stage where we really have to start looking seriously at how we express what's appropriate or not.
Linda Martin, I work for Small Towns in Weld County. I have a question about the P3 tool. You infer that consolidation of systems makes that a more usable tool. Is there a level you think at which P3 is a project is too small for P3?
Okay, the question is, when does a project become too small to use P3 as a model?
That's a tough question. It really depends on the project and what you're trying to do. A design build can be any size. So, it just comes down to putting it together. There becomes some economies of scale for the contractor and the design team, and I'll let the engineering guys respond to that. But from that perspective, none. When you get into financing and those elements, yes, there are going to be some limits. When the international firms first came in the United States, it was 100 million and above. That number's been driven down because of the changing financing environment, and a lot of the companies in the United States are now getting into the space. And I think they can go much smaller than that. I've seen some in the 2, 3, 4, 5 million range of the project, and it just depends how efficient it is in putting it together.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say before answering that question is just make sure that your procurement rules and your contracts can be written in a way that works for you and for somebody you're bringing to the table. If those are not in place, don't even think about P3 yet. Just go and talk with your procurement folks. Talk with those people who have done it before. Make sure that you've modified your conditions and how you're going to procure and how you as a public entity are going to have something other than least cost procurement as your decision, and you can defend it. then you're ready to think about this, and then you can think about the size of the project you're looking at.
Okay. Neil?
Well, it's just an opportunity to make one more point. If you're small towns, like in Weld County, there's an aspect of regionalization that we didn't hit too hard. When you think about regionalizing, it doesn't have to be complete buyouts, but if you look at what's going on in some regionalization efforts through private water companies, once they take over systems, they find that you can release some of the engineering talent and some of the other talent that can be done regionally.
What, you're firing us?
What? No, that's why I haven't done that yet. Just about to. But once that's done, there's no reason that couldn't be turned over to a private company, or it couldn't be leveraged. What would you call it if you go public to private? It's not a leveraged buyout, but you would spin it off and create a private company. That's kind of what Louisville Water is that kind of a private company. Anyway, that's a long story. It could be taken further.
So again, a round of applause for our provocateur, Dr. Neil Grigg, Brian Burnett, Peter Binney, Lowell Clary, and our moderator, Chris Woodcup.